Ethan Carter was 19 when he stood at the edge of a small flea market with $5 in his pocket and no place to sleep that night. A loose metal sign clanged in the wind behind him, and the sharp sound made him turn as if someone had called his name. The market was nearly empty. Most vendors had already packed their tables, leaving behind scraps that no one wanted. The air smelled of dust and old wood, and the sky had started to dim into a pale gray. Ethan pulled his thin jacket tighter around his chest, feeling the cold press through the fabric. He had been walking for hours. His shoes were worn down at the soles, and each step felt heavier than the last. Food had crossed his mind more than once. A small meal would have been easy. $5 was just enough for something warm, something real. But his eyes kept drifting past the food stands. That was when he saw it. At the far corner of the market, half hidden behind a stack of broken furniture, sat a small wooden shed. It leaned slightly to one side, its paint chipped and faded to a dull gray. One of its panels hung loose, and the roof looked like it might collapse with a strong push. A handwritten sign was nailed to the front. $5, take it. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes tracing the rough lines of the wood. The shed was barely large enough to stand inside, but it had walls. It had a door. It had something he had not felt in days. A boundary. "That thing?" a voice called from behind him. Ethan turned to see an older man sitting on a folding chair, watching him with a faint smirk. "It's junk," the man said. "Been sitting there all day. No one wants it." Ethan nodded slowly but did not step away. His fingers brushed against the surface of the wood. It felt cold and rough, but solid in a way that made him pause. "You could get food instead," the man added. "Be smarter." Ethan looked down at the $5 bill in his hand. It was slightly crumpled, soft from being folded too many times. For a moment, he imagined a warm meal, a chair, a place where he could rest without thinking. Then he looked back at the shed. Food would be gone in minutes. This could last longer. "I'll take it," Ethan said quietly. The man let out a short laugh, shaking his head as he stood up. "Your choice." Ethan handed over the money, feeling its absence the second it left his fingers. The man waved a hand toward the shed. "It's yours. Do whatever you want with it." Ethan stepped closer again, this time as its owner. The word felt strange in his mind. Owner. He reached out and pressed his palm flat against the side. For a brief moment, everything was still. Then, as his weight shifted slightly, he noticed it. The ground beneath one corner gave a faint, hollow sound. It took Ethan the rest of the evening to move the shed. He could not carry it in one piece. The wood was too weak, and the frame bent when he tried to lift it. So he worked slowly, pulling it apart plank by plank, stacking each piece in a small pile beside the market. His hands grew sore, and small splinters pressed into his skin, but he kept going. By the time the sky turned dark, he had everything laid out on the ground. The empty lot he chose was only a short walk away. It sat between two quiet streets, surrounded by a low fence that had gaps wide enough to step through. Weeds covered most of the space, and the dirt beneath them felt dry and uneven. No one stopped him. No one asked questions. Piece by piece, Ethan carried the shed across the street. Each trip felt longer than the last. His arms shook from the weight, and his breathing grew shallow, but he did not rest for long. The cold had started to settle deeper into the air. He needed shelter before night fully arrived. When all the pieces were finally in the lot, he stood still for a moment, staring at them. The shed looked even smaller now, broken into parts. It felt like a mistake for just a second. Then he knelt down and began again. He did not rebuild it perfectly. The panels did not line up the way they once had. One wall leaned slightly inward, and the door did not close all the way. But it stood. It held together, just enough. That was enough. Ethan stepped inside and lowered himself onto the rough wooden floor. The space smelled faintly of damp wood and dust. A thin crack in the wall let in a narrow line of streetlight, cutting across the floor in a pale strip. He pulled his jacket tighter and leaned his back against the wall. The ground beneath him felt uneven. At first, he thought it was just the dirt below the floor, but when he shifted his weight, a soft, hollow sound echoed beneath him. It was faint, but clear enough to notice. He froze. Slowly, he pressed his hand against the floor and tapped once with his knuckles. A dull thump answered. He tapped again, a little harder this time. The sound changed. It was not solid. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. One of the wooden planks near the corner looked slightly different from the rest. The edge was not flush. It sat just a little higher, as if it had been moved before. His fingers slid along the gap. Cold air brushed against his skin. For a moment, he hesitated. His chest tightened, and his breath slowed. The night around him felt quieter now, as if the world outside had stepped back. Then he hooked his fingers under the edge of the plank and pulled. It resisted at first. Then, with a short crack, it shifted. A thin line of darkness opened beneath it. The plank lifted just enough for Ethan to slide his fingers underneath. He pulled again, slower this time. The wood scraped against the frame with a dry, rough sound that echoed in the small shed. Dust shook loose and drifted into the air, catching faint light from the crack in the wall. When the plank finally came free, Ethan set it aside and leaned closer. A dark opening sat beneath it. Cold air rose from below, brushing against his face. It carried a damp, earthy smell, different from the dry dust of the shed. The space looked narrow at first, no wider than his shoulders, but it did not end where the light faded. It went deeper. Ethan stayed still, listening. The night outside was quiet, no footsteps, no voices, only the soft hum of distant traffic and the faint creak of the shed as it settled. He reached down and let his hand hover over the opening. Nothing moved. No sound came from below. His chest tightened as he pulled his hand back. The thought of leaving it alone crossed his mind. He could place the plank back, lie down, and try to sleep. Ignore it until morning. But the hollow sound still echoed in his head. Something had been built here. Something hidden. Alden swallowed and leaned forward again. He lowered one leg into the opening, feeling for the ground below. His shoe touched something solid after a short drop. It felt packed, like dirt pressed down over time. He shifted his weight and carefully lowered himself inside. The space was smaller than he expected. He had to bend slightly, his shoulders brushing against the wooden sides. The air felt cooler, heavier. Each breath carried the scent of soil and old wood. Above him, the faint strip of light from the shed floor framed the opening like a pale outline. Ethan crouched and reached out in front of him. His fingers moved slowly through the darkness until they touched the ground. It was uneven, scattered with small stones and loose dirt. He swept his hand gently across the surface, feeling for anything that did not belong. At first, there was nothing, just earth. Then his hand struck something hard. He froze. Carefully, he brushed the dirt away. The shape beneath his fingers felt smooth, colder than the soil around it. Not stone, not wood. Metal. Ethan's breathing grew shallow as he cleared more of the surface. The object was flat on top, with edges that formed sharp corners. It was not large, but it was solid, buried just beneath the ground as if it had been placed there on purpose. His fingers traced along one side until they found a seam. A lid. He pulled his hand back slightly, staring into the darkness even though he could not see it. Someone had hidden this. Someone had sealed it and left it beneath the shed, covered by a loose plank that was never meant to stay hidden forever. Ethan reached forward again and pressed both hands against the object. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he began to dig it out. The dirt was packed tight around the metal box. Ethan worked slowly, using his hands to loosen the soil. Each movement felt heavier than the last, but he did not stop. His fingers pushed through the cold earth, scraping against small stones and roots that had grown around the object over time. The box did not move at first. It felt fixed in place, as if the ground itself was holding onto it. Ethan shifted his position, planting one knee into the dirt for balance. He leaned forward and dug along the edges, clearing space around each side. The soil began to give way in small clumps, falling into the corners of the hidden space. His hands were soon covered in mud. Still, he kept going. After several minutes, the box loosened slightly. It shifted under his grip with a dull scrape, sending a low sound through the ground beneath him. Ethan paused, listening, but nothing else followed. No voices, no movement above, just silence. He took a slow breath and pulled again. This time, the box came free. It was heavier than he expected. He lifted it carefully and set it down in front of him. The surface was coated in a thin layer of rust, but the shape remained solid. A small latch sat at the front, sealed tight. Ethan wiped his hands against his jacket, leaving dark streaks across the fabric. For a moment, he just stared at it. The box felt out of place, too deliberate, too carefully hidden to be random. He reached forward and touched the latch. It resisted at first, stiff from years underground. He pressed harder, and with a short snap, it gave way. The sound echoed softly in the confined space. Ethan lifted the lid. Inside, the darkness shifted. He leaned closer, letting what little light came from above fall into the box. Papers, carefully folded and stacked. Not torn, not damaged beyond use. The edges were worn, but the contents had been protected. Beneath the papers, something else caught his eye. A small, rolled piece of material tied with a thin string. Ethan picked up the top sheet. The paper felt dry, but strong. Lines of writing covered the surface in neat, steady strokes. Names, dates, numbers, arranged in a way that felt official. He did not understand all of it, but one word stood out clearly. Address. Ethan's eyes moved across the page, following the line until it ended in a location that felt familiar. The street name matched the area around him, the lot above. His chest tightened. He reached for another sheet, flipping it open. More writing, more names. One repeated several times, always near the same place on the page. The same signature, the same hand. Beneath the stack, he untied the string around the rolled material and opened it carefully. A map, rough but detailed enough to follow. Lines marked out sections of land, with boundaries drawn in dark ink. One section was circled, and a small mark pointed directly to where the shed now stood. Ethan looked up toward the opening above him. The ground, the shed, the hidden space, all of it connected. He lowered his gaze back to the box, his mind racing through pieces that did not yet fully fit together. This was not random. This place had belonged to someone, and whatever had happened, it had been left unfinished. Ethan gathered the papers slowly, holding them closer now. For the first time in days, the weight in his chest felt different. Not just hunger, not just cold, something else had taken its place. A question that needed an answer. Ethan did not sleep much that night. He climbed out of the hidden space and placed the plank back over the opening, pressing it down until it sat flat against the floor. Then he sat in the corner of the shed, the metal box resting beside him, his back against the wall. The papers lay across his lap. He read them again and again, even when the words blurred in the dim light. Each line felt important, but also incomplete. Names repeated. Dates stretched back years. The same address appeared more than once, always tied to the land beneath him. It was not just paper. It was proof of something. Morning came slowly. Pale light slipped through the cracks in the shed walls, turning the darkness into a dull gray. The air felt colder than before, and Ethan's body ached from the hard floor. He folded the papers carefully and placed them back inside the box. For a moment, he thought about hiding it again, but something told him not to. Instead, he kept it close. By midday, the quiet of the lot had changed. Footsteps passed more often now. Cars moved along the nearby street. Voices drifted over the fence, breaking the stillness that had filled the space the night before. Ethan stayed near the shed, watching. That was when he noticed the man. He stood just outside the fence, his eyes fixed on the structure. He was not like the others who passed by. He did not glance and move on. He stayed. Watching, Ethan stepped out of the shed, his body tense. The man pushed through the gap in the fence and walked closer, his shoes pressing into the dry dirt. "You staying here?" the man asked, his voice calm but firm. Ethan nodded once. "It's just a shed," he said. "I bought it." The man's gaze moved over the wood, then down to the ground beneath it. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if measuring something unseen. "This lot," the man said slowly. "You know anything about it?" Ethan shook his head. The man let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "Not many people do," he said. "But land like this doesn't stay empty for no reason." Ethan felt his grip tighten around the edge of the box behind him. "What do you mean?" he asked. The man looked back at him, studying his face for a moment. "Means," he said, "if you found something here, you better figure out what it is before someone else does." A silence followed. The wind moved through the lot, brushing against the shed and making the loose panels shift with a soft creak. Ethan held his ground. "I didn't find anything," he said. The man watched him a second longer, then gave a small nod. "Maybe," he replied. "Or maybe you just don't know what you're holding yet." He turned and walked back toward the fence, stepping through without another word. Ethan stood still until he was gone. Then he looked down at the box. For the first time, the weight of it felt different. Not just heavy, important, and possibly something others would try to take. Ethan waited until the street grew quiet again before he moved. He wrapped the metal box in a piece of cloth torn from the inside of the shed and held it close to his chest. Each step toward the main road felt heavier than the last, as if the ground beneath him had changed overnight. The records office sat 3 blocks away. It was a small building with faded paint and narrow windows. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and a soft bell rang above him. Inside, the air felt still, filled with the dry scent of paper and time. A woman sat behind a desk near the back, sorting through a stack of files. She looked up as Ethan approached, her eyes briefly scanning his worn clothes before settling on his face. "Can I help you?" she asked. Ethan placed the box gently on the counter. "I found some documents," he said. "I think they're about land nearby." The woman hesitated, then reached forward and opened the box. One by one, she lifted the papers, her expression shifting as she read. Her movements slowed. The room seemed quieter with each page she turned. "These," she said softly. "Where did you get these?" "In a shed," Ethan replied. "On an empty lot." She nodded once, more to herself than to him, and stood up. "Wait here." Ethan watched as she carried the papers into a back room. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving him alone in the silence. Time stretched. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes fixed on the door. Every second felt longer than it should have. When the door finally opened, the woman stepped out with another file in her hands. She placed it on the counter and opened it beside the documents Ethan had brought. "You were right to bring these," she said. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his chest tight. "This land," she continued, pointing to the map, "was registered decades ago, but something went wrong. The owner passed away, and the transfer was never completed." She turned a page, revealing an old record with faded ink. No next of kin was confirmed. No claim was filed. It was left in between. Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said carefully, "the property was never legally reassigned. It's been sitting unclaimed all this time." His breath caught. "And these papers?" he asked. "They show intent," she replied. "Ownership, boundaries, signatures. Enough to reopen the case." Ethan's hands tightened at his sides. "So what happens now?" The woman met his eyes. "If you file a claim using these documents, you have a path," she said. "But it has to be done properly, and quickly." Ethan nodded, his thoughts racing. Outside, the world moved as it always had. But inside that small room, something had shifted. For the first time, the ground beneath him felt like it might finally belong to someone again. And that someone could be him. The waiting felt longer than anything Ethan had known before. Days passed in slow, quiet stretches. He stayed close to the shed, rarely leaving except when necessary. Each sound outside made him look up. Each passing figure felt like a question he could not answer yet. The metal box never left his side. At night, he placed it near his chest as he slept, one hand resting on top of it. The same cold air moved through the cracks in the walls, but it no longer felt as empty as before. Now, there was something to lose. On the fourth day, a letter arrived. It was handed to him at the edge of the lot by a man who did not stay long enough to speak. Ethan stood still for a moment, staring at the envelope before opening it. The paper inside was official, clean, certain. His name was written clearly across the top. The claim had been accepted. Ethan read the line again, slower this time, as if the words might change if he moved too fast. They did not. The land, the shed, everything within its boundary, now belonged to him. For a long moment, he said nothing. The wind moved softly across the lot, brushing through the dry grass and against the worn wood of the shed. The same loose panel creaked, just as it had on the first night. But the sound felt different now. Ethan stepped inside and closed the door as much as it would allow. The space was still small, still rough, but it no longer felt temporary. He set the metal box down in the corner and looked around. Then he began to work. He fixed the loose panel first, pressing it back into place and securing it with a small piece of wood. He adjusted the door so it sat closer to the frame. Each movement was slow, careful, as if he were building something far greater than what could be seen. The shed began to change. Not all at once, but enough. As the light faded outside, Ethan stood in the doorway and looked out across the lot. The ground stretched quietly in front of him, open and still, waiting. He took a steady breath. For the first time in a long while, he was not searching for a place to stand. He already had one,